Is Flowstate now the midpoint in FPV quadcopter history? Would you say Flowstate is more like today or the early days? I love this question in part because it has to do with my movie.
For the most part, people don't understand drones. So when they do,
did you know I made a
they're
movie?
comfortable with it. When they
Okay,
don't,
I helped make a movie. I participated in the production of a movie. Can't believe it's not over a million.
And then when you go
views.
out and see it in real life, it's like, well, that's freaking cool as crap.
You remember that scene in Star Wars with the speed
Oh,
bikes? Everybody,
look, it's Chunky Pandemic Bardwell. I'll tell you a secret. I may have told this before. So this was recorded during my Chunky Pandemic phase. I think we all had a Chunky Pandemic phase. I recorded some scenes of this sitting on my porch, and when I saw the sample footage, for whatever reason, the shirt that I put on looked way too tight because I had put on weight, and the shirt and I'm looking at this footage, and the whole time I'm like, oh, I hate this. So I was executive producer on this film. That means I put up a bunch of money to make the film, and then someone else did all the actual work. Executive producers, kids. And I called the director and I said, James, can we reshoot this interview? Because I have to, I cannot make this movie. And this is how many movies am I going to make, right? I'm going to put this out into the world. Potentially it's going to become really popular. And the whole time I'm going to be like, oh my God, my shirt is way too tight. I look like a fatso. And he drove from Asheville, not quite Asheville, but basically Asheville, North Carolina, back to Atlanta and reshot the interview with me, the whole interview. Took a whole day out of his, and I wore a looser shirt. Oh, man. I feel like this movie, the freestyle that is represented in this movie reflects the time period that it was shot in. And I think if you look at sort of divisions in FPV history, one of them is certainly the 2020 period when remote ID started to become a thing. And then sometime in, I'm not sure the exact date, it actually became a thing. Why was there a notification sound? I have to close this out. I'm getting notifications. Sorry about that. Before remote ID became a thing, FPV was very freewheeling. I think if you certainly other people would make different divisions than I do, but as I just think off the cuff here, there was a time period when FPV was a very experimental. It was guys putting backup cameras from cars and security cameras on drones. It was people making their own flight controllers out of Arduinos, and it was very experimental. And then it started to be a little bit more commercialized, you could buy a flight controller instead of having to make one, but it was still very, very experimental and developmental. And then there came a shift. And perhaps it was in the 2016 to 2018 timeframe. Exactly when you think the shift happened is going to depend on a lot of variables. But where it became much more commercial, the day when someone could say, I want to get into FPV because I want to put FPV videos on YouTube and get sponsored. Nobody in the early days set out to get sponsored. We/they. I would even say I came along in that second wave, if that's what you want to call it. I wasn't really part of that first wave, or if I was, I just barely caught the tail of it. Where people were just doing it and they're putting it on YouTube because, I don't know, that's just what you did, but nobody was out to get sponsored, really. They just wanted to do it. Then it became more commercial. There was a lot more development of hardware, a lot more marketing and competition to develop the newest, bestest hardware. The hype train kind of started to get rolling. companies came in, companies started to move into the market explicitly. It wasn't just like, hey, I want to make FPV products. It was like, I want to make money, and FPV is an opportunity to make money. We started to see more of that. And then I think you go into sort of like the third generation, if you will, when remote ID starts to become a thing. And that's where the world at large really starts to take note of FPV, right? You start to see regulations, you start to see more government attention, and you also start to see pilots dropping out to some degree because they're like, meh, I don't want to be a part of it anymore if it's not this sort of freewheeling thing. If I had to think of another dividing line, it would be probably around 2022 or 2023. Somewhere in there, public attention of the military use of drones, driven by the war in Ukraine, really kicked off. And I think that's another sort of dividing line in the history of FPV. And we're kind of in that phase right now. And part of that, and another sort of major development, was that when the pandemic happened, there were big supply chain disruptions. Lots of electronics specifically got way more expensive and or were out of stock. And so there was a price shift in the availability of FPV stuff. Stuff got more expensive, and that sort of had a big effect. It's interesting because in roundabout mid to late 2020, when we were still sort of having the pandemic, there was a period where a whole lot of people didn't have a job, and then the government gave everybody a $1,500 stimulus check. And I can tell you for a fact, a whole bunch of those people decided to get into FPV. There was at least one store owner who I've talked to said they had their biggest month in history during that period. And my affiliate sales also, I had some of, but not quite the biggest months I'd ever had during that period, which is weird because here we are. Everything is expensive. Things are out of stock. Like, there's all these questions about, like, you can't buy a video card, you can't buy a computer. There's all these questions about, what is going on in the world. A whole bunch of people are out of work, and then, like, suddenly people are having the best month they ever had. A couple people. And it's kind of weird. That quickly tapered off, though, and I feel like now things are more on a downswing. So the question was, little history lesson from Bardwell. The question, where did the question go? The question got cleared. Oh, nope. Hang on. Is Flowstate the midpoint in FPV history? I don't know if it's the midpoint, but I do think that the Flowstate movie came about. It was inspired in part by remote ID. So Flowstate came about at the end of what I would call the second chapter in the history of FPV. The first chapter being sort of the freewheeling experimental chapter. The second chapter being now it's getting more popularity, a little bit commercialized. You can just as a young man, you can be like, I want to get into FPV, and you could just buy some stuff and build it, And then the third chapter being government starts to take notice and remote ID is a thing. The fourth chapter being, the war in Ukraine kicks off public awareness of the use of drones for war, and that, And I think what we see in this video reflects the past. More than, because that's what you make a documentary about, things that happened in the past, not things that happen in the future. So I would say that, and I do kind of feel like the film in some way is kind of a parting, a sentimental parting love letter, I would call it, to that phase of FPV. Sometimes people watch Flowstate and they say, like, the things that you're talking about in this video don't reflect the state of FPV. Of course, this was back when the film came out. They're like, well, that doesn't reflect the state of FPV. It's kind of dated. It would be like if you were in the 90s and you made a video about music in the 80s, and you're like, well, that's a history documentary. It's not really. And I'm like, I'm kind of okay with it. Like, I really wanted to capture these people and this feel, And I didn't capture it completely. And there's many people who got left out, who could have been in there. And also there's people who came before my generation. People are like, why didn't you have some of the OGs? Like we had Tommy Tabahia in here. Nobody could say he's not an OG. We had Steele in there. Nobody could say he's not an OG. But they're like, what about guys like Metal Danny or Boris B? Why weren't they in it? Why was it just Like, well, I made the film. It was the people that I know and could get a hold of and, think of, and it reflects, my biases. But it also reflects the period of FPV where I was coming up and who was prominent in that period. This reflects who we could get to do an interview with us. We really wanted to get Johnny FPV, and we're not able to get him because he's very busy. And so, for example, some people we just couldn't get. Anyway, thank you for the question and for the opportunity to talk about my film.